The aliens declared humans a dead species. Then Earth started its final war. The ships came without warning, 6 of them, hanging silent in orbit above Earth like dark seeds dropped into the sky. They did not fire. They did not send missiles or drones. They simply waited, glowing faintly against the stars, while every radar station on the planet screamed the same message at once. Within an hour, every government on Earth knew. Within a day, every person on Earth knew. General Elena Voss stood in the command center beneath Colorado, watching the feed from 3 different satellites at once. The ships were huge, easily 10 times the size of the largest aircraft carrier ever built, and they moved with a strange grace, as if gravity did not fully apply to them. She had spent 30 years in the military, preparing for wars against other nations. Nothing in her training had prepared her for this. "Still no communication?" she asked. "Nothing," said the young officer at the console. "They're just sitting there, watching us." It took 11 days for the aliens to speak. When they finally did, it was not a threat, not a demand, not even a greeting. It was a broadcast, sent in perfect English, French, Mandarin, and dozens of other languages at once, playing on every screen and every radio on the planet at the same time. The voice was calm, almost gentle, and that gentleness frightened people more than any threat could have. "People of Earth, we are representatives of the Vanterel Concord, a union of civilized worlds that has existed for over 11,000 of your years. We have observed your species for the past 2 centuries. Our conclusion has been reached. Humanity has been classified as a dead species. This classification is not a threat. It is a fact, arrived at through careful study of your history, your environment, and your behavior. Your species has already begun the process of destroying itself. We are here to manage the end of that process, with as much mercy as possible." The broadcast ended there. For a long moment, the entire world went silent, and then it did not stop screaming for weeks. Dr. Marcus Chen was a linguist and a xenobiologist, though until 11 days ago there had been no such job as xenobiologist anywhere on Earth. He had spent his career studying how language shaped thought, writing papers that maybe 200 people in the world ever read. Now he sat in a secure office in Geneva, staring at a folder marked Top Secret, feeling his hands shake slightly as he opened it. Inside were transcripts. The Vanterel Concord had agreed to a single meeting, a single conversation, before they moved forward with what they called closure procedures. The meeting would happen in 3 days. Marcus had been chosen, along with 24 other scientists and diplomats from around the world, to represent humanity in that room. He did not feel ready. He did not think anyone could feel ready. Ambassador Sarah Klein had spent 15 years working for the United Nations, mostly on refugee crises and water disputes between neighboring countries. She had seen humanity at its worst, watching people fight over dwindling resources, while children starved. She had also seen humanity at its best, watching strangers give everything they had to help people they had never met. When she was called into the room where the Vanterel Concord waited, she carried both memories with her. The room itself was strange. It existed inside one of the alien ships, though nobody understood exactly how the humans had gotten there. One moment Sarah was standing in a secure facility outside Geneva, and the next, she was in a chamber made of some smooth gray material, lit by no visible source, sitting across from 3 beings unlike anything she had ever imagined. They were tall, nearly 8 feet, with long limbs, and skin that shifted color slightly, depending on the light, somewhere between blue and gray. Their faces had no mouths that she could see, but somehow they spoke, the words appearing directly in her mind, translated perfectly into English. The one who spoke first identified himself as High Overseer Threl Khan, the leader of the delegation, and, as Sarah would later learn, one of the most powerful military commanders in the entire Concord. "You have been brought here so that you understand," Threl said. "This is not an act of cruelty. We have watched 11,000 years of civilizations rise and fall. We know the signs of a species that cannot survive itself. Your wars, your pollution, your inability to work together, even when your survival depends on it. We have seen this pattern before, on hundreds of worlds. It always ends the same way. Total collapse, usually within 1 to 3 centuries of reaching your current level of technology." Marcus Chen leaned forward. His voice came out steadier than he expected. "And what do you propose to do about it?" "Mercy," Threl said simply. A dead species classification means the Concord will not allow your species to spread its instability to other worlds. It also means we do not believe your suffering should be prolonged unnecessarily. We offer relocation for a small number of your people, those judged capable of controlled integration into Concord society. For the rest, we offer a swift and painless ending, far kinder than the slow collapse you would otherwise face. The room went cold. Sarah felt her stomach drop. Around her, she saw the same reaction on every human face, a mixture of disbelief and rising anger. "You're talking about killing 8 billion people," she said, "and calling it a gift." "We are talking about preventing centuries of suffering," Threll replied, and there was no anger in his voice, no cruelty, only the calm certainty of someone who believed completely in what he was saying. "We understand this is difficult to hear. It has always been difficult, for every species we have classified this way. But the data is clear. Your species is already dying. We simply intend to make the process gentle." There was another Vanterell in the room, sitting slightly behind Threll, who had not spoken yet. Marcus noticed her watching the humans with an expression he could not quite read, something that might have been curiosity, or might have been discomfort. Her name, according to the brief files the humans had been given, was Kaelin Dross, a Concord scientist who had spent decades studying Earth from a distance. "There is precedent for reconsideration," Kaelin said quietly, the first time she had spoken. Threll turned toward her sharply, but she continued. "The classification is not permanent. If a species demonstrates capability for change, for unity, for growth, beyond the patterns that led to classification, the Concord has reversed judgments before." "That has happened 3 times in 11,000 years, Threll said, his voice carrying a warning edge now. "Do not give them false hope." "I am giving them the truth," Kaelin said, "which is more than false comfort." Threll turned back to the humans. "You will be given 100 days. During this time you may submit to relocation processing, which we recommend for your own good. At the end of 100 days, closure procedures will begin. I would advise against resistance. Our fleet strength is beyond anything your species can currently comprehend." The meeting ended shortly after. The humans were returned to Earth the same way they had arrived, in an instant, standing again in the secure facility outside Geneva, as if no time had passed at all. Sarah Klein sat down on the floor of the empty room, and did not move for several minutes. Marcus Chen stood by the window, looking up at a sky that suddenly felt much smaller than it used to. News of the meeting spread within hours, despite every effort to keep it contained. There was no containing something like this. Governments that had spent decades refusing to cooperate on climate agreements or trade deals suddenly found themselves on emergency calls with each other, night after night, trying to figure out what could possibly be done against an enemy that could cross the stars. General Elena Voss was called into a meeting with the Joint Chiefs and representatives from a dozen allied nations less than a day after the broadcast reached the public. The mood in the room was somewhere between panic and disbelief. "We have nothing that can touch those ships," said an Air Force general, tapping the table for emphasis. "Nothing. Our best estimates say their hull plating alone could shrug off a nuclear warhead without damage." "Then we find something else," Voss said. "Find what? We don't even understand their technology." "Then we study it," she said. "We have 100 days. That's not nothing. That's more time than most militaries get to prepare for anything. We use it." It was a strange thing, watching the world change over the following weeks. Old rivalries did not disappear, not completely, but something shifted. Nations that had been enemies for generations found themselves sharing research, pooling resources, building coalition after coalition, driven by the same simple fear. For the first time in human history, everyone on the planet faced the exact same threat, at the exact same time, with the exact same stakes. Marcus Chen was assigned to a new project, one buried so deep in secrecy that even he wasn't told its full scope at first. It was called Project Continuance, and its purpose was simple: gather every piece of unexplained technology, every recovered object, every strange signal that governments around the world had quietly kept hidden for decades, and bring it all together in one place. What Marcus found there changed everything. Buried beneath a mountain in Nevada, in a facility so classified that even the president had needed special clearance to know its full contents, sat the wreckage of something that had crashed in the desert almost 80 years earlier. It was not human. It had never been human. The wreckage had been studied in secret for generations, its purpose never fully understood, its origin never explained. Until now. It's Concorde technology, Marcus said, staring at the twisted metal frame, still faintly glowing after 8 decades buried in the earth. An old scout craft. Maybe from before the Concorde even had contact protocols in place. Can we use it? Voss asked, standing beside him. I don't know yet, Marcus admitted. But if we can understand even a fraction of how it worked, we might learn something about their weaknesses. No civilization builds perfect technology. Somewhere in here, there has to be something we can use. It was not the only such discovery. As word spread through the highest levels of government, that humanity was now searching for anything that might help, secrets that had been buried for generations began to surface. A downed craft in Siberia. Strange metal fragments recovered from the ocean floor near Australia. Signals intercepted decades earlier, and dismissed as noise, now revealed to be fragments of Concorde communication chatter. Faint echoes of ships that had passed near Earth, long before the 6 vessels ever arrived. Sarah Klein, meanwhile, found herself thrust into a role she had never trained for. She became the human face of negotiations, meeting again and again with Kalen Dross, the one Vanterel who had shown any hint of sympathy. Threll refused all further direct contact, considering the negotiations a formality that changed nothing. But Kalen kept coming back. Why do you help us? Sarah asked her, during one of their meetings in the strange gray chamber aboard the ship. Kalen was quiet for a long moment. I have studied your species for 40 of your years, she said finally. I have read your poetry. I have watched your wars, yes, but I have also watched what comes after your wars. I have seen how you rebuild. I have seen mothers on opposite sides of a conflict weep for each other's children. No species that is truly dead does that. A dead species stops caring. Yours has not stopped. Then help us prove it, Sarah said. Help us show the Concorde we're not what Threll thinks we are. It is not that simple, Kalen said. The classification, once made, is difficult to reverse. Overseer Threll is not cruel by his own understanding. He believes completely in what he does. He has performed closure procedures on 4 other worlds in his career, and in his mind, each one was an act of mercy. He will not be moved by sentiment. He will only be moved by proof. What kind of proof? Kalen looked at her with something that might have been sadness. The kind your species has never had reason to offer before. Proof that when faced with annihilation, you do not simply fight to survive. You fight to become something greater than what you were. The 100 days ticked down, one after another, and across the planet, something began to happen that had never happened before in recorded history. Nations stopped competing and started building together. Soldiers who had spent careers preparing to fight each other, now trained side by side, studying alien wreckage, testing new weapons, running simulations against an enemy whose full strength no one could truly measure. Elena Voss stood in front of the newly formed Earth Defense Coalition, a gathering of officers and scientists and engineers from every corner of the globe, and gave the first speech of what would become known, much later, as the beginning of humanity's final war. They think we're already dead, she said. They think our story is already written, that all that's left is to decide how gently the ending comes. They've watched 100 other species end this way, and maybe they're right about all of them. But they don't know us. They don't know what happens when humanity is told it has no future. We've spent our entire history proving people wrong who said we couldn't survive something. This is just the biggest one yet. Somewhere above the atmosphere, the 6 Concorde ships continued their silent watch, patient and certain, counting down the final weeks of what they believed would be humanity's peaceful end. They had no idea what was coming. 40 days into the countdown, the first skirmish happened, though nobody on Earth had planned for it to happen that way. A small Concorde scout craft, far smaller than the 6 massive ships in orbit, descended into the atmosphere over the Pacific Ocean without warning. Its stated purpose, transmitted in the same calm voice as before, was to conduct what Overseer Threll called a compliance survey, a routine check to measure how many humans had begun the relocation process. Only a handful of people, mostly desperate or convinced there was no other choice, had submitted to it. General Elena Voss had expected something like this. She had spent the last month positioning defense assets in ways that would not look like an obvious buildup, hoping to avoid provoking an early attack while still preparing for one. When the scout craft entered restricted airspace above a Pacific Fleet exercise, an automated response triggered before any human even gave the order. A new type of missile, developed in secret over the past month by combining recovered Concorde technology with human engineering, launched from a modified naval vessel. It was not powerful enough to destroy the scout craft outright. Nobody had expected it to be. But it struck the craft's shields with a frequency pattern reverse-engineered from the old crashed scout ship in Nevada, and for just a moment, those shields flickered and failed. The scout craft did not fall from the sky. It was too well built for that. But it staggered, listing hard to one side, and for the first time in the entire encounter between humanity and the Vanterel Concorde, an alien vessel had been hurt by human hands. Marcus Chen watched the footage from a secure lab beneath Geneva, his heart pounding. They shielded it wrong, he said, half to himself. Or we found the one frequency they weren't shielding against. Either way, it worked. It actually worked. Within hours, the footage was being studied by every remaining research team on the planet. The scout craft had retreated back to orbit, damaged but intact, and the 6 larger ships above Earth had gone completely silent for nearly 2 full days afterward. When Threll finally spoke again, his voice on the broadcast had lost some of its earlier calm. "This act of aggression will be noted," he said. "We remind you that resistance only prolongs suffering. We advise full compliance with relocation procedures. 60 days remain." But something had changed. For the first time, humanity had proof, real and undeniable, that the Concorde's technology was not beyond their reach. It was not magic. It was simply more advanced, built by beings who had been doing this far longer, but built by beings all the same, following rules of physics that could be studied, understood, and eventually matched. Sarah Klein met with Kalen Dross 2 days after the incident, expecting anger, expecting the negotiations to collapse entirely. Instead, she found Kalen almost thoughtful. "Threll is furious," Kalen admitted. "He wanted this to remain peaceful until the end. An act of aggression against Concorde forces gives him justification to move faster." "We didn't attack anyone," Sarah said. "That craft was flying over our fleet exercise." "I know," Kalen said. "I have already argued this point to the council overseeing this classification. But you must understand something important. What you did today was not just an act of defense. It was proof. Proof that concerns me more than it should, because I do not know if it will save you or doom you faster." "What do you mean?" "The Concorde has classified over 300 species as dead across its long history," Kalen said. "Of those, only a handful ever showed the capacity to damage Concorde technology during the observation period. Every single one of those species was moved to immediate closure, rather than allowed to complete the full waiting period. Overseer Threll will use this to argue the same should be done for you." Sarah felt cold. "So proving we could fight back might get us killed faster." "Unless it also proves something else," Kalen said, "that you are capable of far more than the Concorde initially believed, that your classification itself was wrong. This is the argument I intend to make. But I will need more than one incident to convince the council. I will need a pattern of resistance paired with restraint. Aggression alone confirms Threll's fears. Aggression paired with control, with strategy, with the wisdom to know when to fight and when not to. That is something different entirely." Elena Voss received this message relayed through the diplomatic channel and called an emergency session of the Earth Defense Coalition that same night. "We can't just throw punches every time we get the chance," she told the assembled officers and scientists. "Every fight has to mean something. Every fight has to be a message, not just to them, but through them, to whatever council decides our fate. We fight smart. We fight with purpose. And when we don't have to fight, we don't." It was a difficult message to enforce across an entire planet suddenly consumed with fear and fury. In the weeks that followed, isolated incidents occurred anyway, impossible to fully control. A group of soldiers in Eastern Europe, convinced the end was coming regardless, attempted an unauthorized strike against a Concorde shuttle and were destroyed instantly, their deaths broadcast as a warning by Threll himself. A militia in South America attempted something similar and met the same fate. But alongside those tragedies, something else was happening. The Earth Defense Coalition, now operating with unprecedented cooperation between nations that had barely spoken to each other a year earlier, began developing a real strategy. Not one built on desperate lashing out, but one built on patience, technology, and the quiet accumulation of knowledge. Marcus Chen's team made the first true breakthrough 65 days into the countdown. Working from data gathered off the damaged scout craft, cross-referenced with decades of buried research from the Nevada wreckage, his team identified a critical weakness in how Concorde's shielding technology handled certain electromagnetic frequencies during rapid maneuvering. Their shields are incredible against direct energy weapons, Marcus explained to Voss and the assembled coalition leadership. Truly incredible. Better than anything we could build from scratch in 100 years. But they're tuned for that. They're tuned to stop plasma weapons, particle beams, the kinds of things every Concorde species has been using for thousands of years. They were never designed to handle old-fashioned kinetic impacts, paired with electromagnetic disruption, at the exact moment of shield transition, because no species they've encountered in millennia still relies on anything that primitive. You're saying our old technology might actually be an advantage, Voss said slowly. I'm saying being behind might be the reason we survived this, Marcus said. They've spent 11,000 years fighting wars against people who fight the same way they do. We don't fight that way. We never had the chance to. And that might be exactly what saves us. It was a strange kind of hope, built not on humanity suddenly matching the Concorde's advanced technology, but on humanity's very backwardness becoming an unexpected strength. Voss took the idea and ran with it, ordering a complete shift in the Coalition's weapons development. Rather than trying to build energy weapons to match Concorde firepower directly, teams around the world began developing hybrid systems, combining recovered alien shielding technology with human kinetic weapons, railguns, guided munitions, and clever engineering solutions built specifically to exploit the blind spot Marcus had identified. 80 days into the countdown, the Concorde grew impatient. Overseer Threll addressed humanity once more, and this time, his voice carried an edge that had not been present before. You have used the remaining time, not for compliance, but for continued preparation of resistance, he said. This confirms the classification, rather than challenging it. A species truly capable of growth would recognize the futility of conflict and choose peace. Instead, you choose war, even against an enemy you cannot defeat. 20 days remain before closure procedures begin. I urge you, for the final time, to reconsider. Sarah Klein argued desperately with Kalen in their next meeting. We're not choosing war because we're violent, she said. We're choosing to defend ourselves because that's what any living thing does when it's told it's about to be destroyed for its own good. That's not proof we're dying. That's proof we're alive. Kalen looked troubled, more troubled than Sarah had seen her before. I believe you, she said quietly. But belief is not enough. Threll has gathered enough support on the council now that he no longer needs full consensus to proceed. He has scheduled a vote in 10 days. If it passes, closure will begin immediately, regardless of the remaining time in the original schedule. Can you stop it? I do not know, Kalen admitted, but I intend to try. I need something more than argument. I need evidence strong enough to make even skeptical council members reconsider everything they believe about how a dying species behaves. I need you to survive whatever Threll sends next, not through luck, but through strength. Real strength. The kind that cannot be dismissed as a fluke. Elena Voss received word of the accelerated timeline through Sarah's channel, and gathered the full Earth Defense Coalition leadership within hours. The mood in the room was grim but resolved. They're not waiting for the 100 days anymore, she said. They're moving early, which means we don't get to wait either. Everything we've built, every weapon, every strategy, every piece of technology we've reverse engineered over the last 80 days, we need it ready now, not in 20 days. Now. Across the planet, factories that had spent decades building consumer goods and civilian infrastructure shifted overnight into producing weapons, shielding, and ships, unlike anything humanity had built before. Soldiers who had trained their entire careers for conventional warfare retrained rapidly for a kind of combat nobody fully understood yet, guided by scientists who themselves were only weeks ahead of everyone else in understanding the enemy they faced. Marcus Chen barely slept during those final days, running simulation after simulation, testing every weapon design against models of Concorde shielding technology built from the data his team had gathered. He found himself thinking often about something Kalen had said, relayed through Sarah's reports, about proof that could not be dismissed as a fluke. "They think we're dying," he said to Voss during one of their final planning sessions, exhaustion clear in his voice. "They've watched 300 species die exactly the way they expect us to. We're not going to convince them with words. We're going to convince them the same way every one of those 300 species failed to, by showing them something they've genuinely never seen before." "And what's that?" Voss asked. Marcus looked at the maps and simulations spread across the table. All the accumulated knowledge of a planet that had spent its entire history fighting itself now turned, for the first time, entirely outward. "A species that refuses to die quietly," he said. "Even when everyone, including themselves sometimes, expected them to." 10 days later, the Concorde Council convened for its vote, 30 light-years away, in a chamber that no human would ever see. Hundreds of delegates from dozens of species debated the fate of Earth. Overseer Threll spoke first, and spoke long, cataloging every act of resistance, every weapon developed, every skirmish fought, presenting it all as final proof that humanity's classification was correct, and that mercy delayed any further was mercy denied. Kalen Dross spoke last. She spoke of poetry and sacrifice, of mothers weeping for enemy children, of a species that had been given 100 days to prepare for its own death, and had instead spent every one of those days trying to prove it deserved to live. She asked the council for something almost unprecedented in Concorde history, not indefinite delay, and not immediate closure, but a final test, one decisive engagement, with the full weight of Concorde military strength brought to bear, to see, once and for all, exactly what humanity truly was. The vote was close, closer than anyone on either side expected, but it passed. Above Earth, the 6 ships that had watched in silence for months began to move, and far beyond them, in the deep dark of space, a much larger fleet answered a summons that had been building for weeks. The final war had begun. The Concorde fleet arrived above the moon 3 days after the council vote, and its size alone was enough to make even the most hardened officers in the Earth Defense Coalition go pale. There were 40 ships in total, ranging from smaller escort vessels similar to the 6 that had first arrived in orbit, up to a single massive flagship easily the size of a small city, its hull marked with patterns of light that pulsed slowly, like something breathing. General Elena Voss watched the fleet assemble on the tactical display in the command center beneath Colorado, and felt the weight of the moment settle over the room like a physical thing. "That's the test," she said quietly. "That's what Threll brought to prove we're already dead." "Ma'am," said a young officer. "Orders?" Voss took a slow breath. Everything her people had built over the past 90 days, every ship, every weapon, every strategy, pulled together from 100 different nations, working as one, for the first time in human history, would be measured against that fleet in the coming hours. There was no more time to prepare. There was only time to fight. "Full deployment," she said. "Bring everyone home. Bring everything we've built. It's time." Humanity's response fleet had a name by then, one chosen not by any single government, but by the soldiers and engineers who had built it together. They called it the Continuance Fleet, after the project that had unearthed the old alien wreckage that made so much of it possible. It was smaller than the Concorde force by a wide margin, barely 12 ships against the enemy's 40, but every one of those 12 ships carried weapons designed specifically to exploit the weakness Marcus Chen's team had discovered months earlier. Marcus himself watched the battle unfold from a secure command post, unable to do anything now, but hope his work had been enough. Beside him, Sarah Klein sat with a communications channel open to Kalen Dross, one of the only lines of contact still active between the two sides as the battle began. "Threll insisted on commanding this personally," Kalen said quietly through the channel. "He believes fully in what he does. He is not cruel. He genuinely believes this is the only way to end your suffering with dignity. That belief will not make him fight any less fiercely." "Understood," Sarah said. "Tell your council to watch closely." The battle began, not with the massive flagship, but with a wave of smaller Concorde escort vessels moving to establish a perimeter around the moon before advancing toward Earth itself. Elena Voss had anticipated this. Rather than meeting the escorts head-on, where superior Concorde shielding and firepower would grind down human ships quickly. The Continuance fleet scattered, using the moon's gravity and a scattered minefield of modified kinetic charges positioned in the weeks prior, waiting silently for exactly this moment. The first Concorde escort to cross the minefield triggered a chain reaction of kinetic impacts, paired precisely with electromagnetic pulses, timed to the exact frequency Marcus Chen's team had identified months before. Its shields flared and failed in an instant, and before its crew could compensate, 3 more charges struck the exposed hull directly. The ship did not simply stagger this time. It broke apart entirely, debris scattering silently across the black. Aboard the Concorde flagship, Overseer Threll watched the destruction of his first vessel with something that might have been surprise, if such an emotion still touched him, after 11,000 years of Concorde history behind him. "Recalculate shield harmonics," he ordered. Immediately, across the entire fleet. But recalculating took time, and time was something the Continuance fleet had spent months preparing to exploit. Elena Voss's ships struck fast, hitting isolated escort vessels before retreating into the cover of lunar craters and debris fields, refusing every attempt by the larger Concorde ships to draw them into open, direct confrontation. It was not the kind of battle Concorde military doctrine had been built to fight. 11,000 years of warfare against civilizations with similar technology levels had taught the Concorde to fight with overwhelming force, delivered directly. Humanity fought instead like something cornered and desperate and endlessly clever, striking from unexpected angles and vanishing before retaliation could land. 4 Concorde escorts were destroyed within the first hour. 2 Continuance fleet ships were lost in the same period, their crews given no chance to escape, a cost that weighed heavily on every mind in the command center beneath Colorado, even as the tactical picture showed unexpected success. "They're adapting," Marcus said, watching the data stream in. "Their shield recalibration is fast, faster than I expected. We won't have this advantage much longer." He was right. By the second hour, Concorde ships had begun adjusting their shield harmonics in real time, and the kinetic strikes that had proven so devastating at first began glancing off without effect. Elena Voss received the updated reports and made a decision immediately. "Pull the fleet back toward Earth," she ordered. "Full retreat formation. We drew blood. Now we make them come to us." It was a controlled retreat, not a rout. Every ship moving in coordinated patterns, designed months earlier for exactly this contingency. The Concorde fleet pursued, Threll himself pushing the main body of his force forward, eager to end the engagement decisively now that his shields had adapted. What he did not know, could not have known, was that Elena Voss had spent the entire retreat drawing his fleet directly over a second line of defense, one built not in space, but on Earth itself. Along the equator, buried deep in newly constructed facilities that had been under continuous secret construction for the past 80 days, a network of massive railgun installations waited, each one built using a combination of human engineering and salvaged Concorde power core technology recovered from the Nevada wreckage. They had never been tested against a live target. There had never been an opportunity to test them safely. As the Concorde fleet crossed into range, pursuing what they believed was a fleeing and desperate human force, General Voss gave the order to fire. The barrage that followed was unlike anything either side had ever seen. Dozens of massive kinetic rounds, each one accelerated to a significant fraction of the speed of light, using Concorde-derived power systems that no human engineer had fully understood even a year earlier, tore through the pursuing Concorde fleet in a matter of seconds. Shields that had adapted perfectly to counter smaller kinetic strikes in space combat simply could not withstand impacts of this scale. 3 more Concorde ships were destroyed outright. A dozen more suffered catastrophic damage. And the massive flagship carrying Overseer Threll himself, though its shields held, was struck hard enough to send shockwaves through its entire structure, knocking out systems across multiple decks and forcing an immediate, undignified retreat back toward the safety of high orbit. In the command center beneath Colorado, the room erupted in something between disbelief and desperate celebration. Elena Voss allowed herself exactly one breath of relief before pushing forward. "Do not celebrate yet," she said sharply, cutting through the noise. "They'll adapt to this too. We bought time, that's all. Use it." Aboard the Concorde flagship, Threll stood amid the wreckage of a command deck that had never been damaged in his entire career, staring at the tactical readouts with an expression his crew had never seen on him before. Beside him, one of his senior officers spoke carefully. "Overseer, the Council will need a full report." "They will have one," Threll said, his voice tight with something that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but held elements of both. "This changes nothing about the classification. A dying animal can still bite when cornered. This proves nothing, except that they will resist to the end." But even as he said it, something in his own certainty had cracked, just slightly, in a way he would not have admitted to anyone. Kaelin Dross, watching the battle unfold from her position aboard a support vessel, felt something entirely different. She had argued for months that humanity possessed something the Concorde's 300 years of dead species classifications had never accounted for, and now she had proof, real and undeniable, playing out in front of the entire fleet. She opened her channel to Sarah Klein immediately. "You held," she said, and there was something like awe in her voice. "You actually held against a full fleet engagement." "We lost ships," Sarah said quietly. "We lost people." "I know," Kaelin said. "And I am sorry for that. But you must understand what this means. No dead species classification in Concorde history has ever produced a defense capable of destroying 7 Concorde vessels and critically damaging a flagship in a single engagement. This is not simply resistance. This is the beginning of a genuine argument for reclassification. I intend to bring this before the Council immediately." "Will it be enough?" Kaelin hesitated. "I do not know," she admitted. "Threll will argue this proves your aggression rather than your capacity for growth. He will push for full planetary bombardment rather than another controlled engagement. The Council is divided. This battle may have saved you today, or it may have simply convinced them to end this more quickly and more completely next time." Sarah closed her eyes, exhaustion and fear washing over her in equal measure. "Then we need to win the next one too." "Yes," Kaelin said quietly. "You do." Back on Earth, in the hours following the battle, humanity learned something about itself that would echo for generations to come, regardless of how the war ultimately ended. For the first time in recorded history, every nation on the planet had fought, together, against a common enemy, and they had won, not completely, not decisively, but enough to prove that the story the Concorde had written about their species was not yet finished. Elena Voss stood before the Earth Defense Coalition that night, exhaustion evident in every line of her face, and delivered a message that would be repeated in every language on the planet within hours. "They came here believing our story was already over," she said. "They came expecting to write the final chapter for us, gently, mercifully, the same way they've done for 300 other species before us. Today, we proved that story wrong. Not finished, just wrong. We have more fighting ahead of us, harder fighting than what we just survived. But we've shown them, and more importantly, we've shown ourselves, that we are not what they think we are." Above the planet, the surviving Concorde fleet regrouped in high orbit, damaged and diminished, while far beyond the edge of the solar system, new ships began the long journey toward Earth, summoned by a council still deeply divided over what to do next. The first battle of the final war was over. The war itself had only just begun. 3 weeks passed before the Concorde returned in force, and those 3 weeks were among the most difficult humanity had ever lived through. The victory over the Moon had cost the Continuance fleet dearly. 2 ships lost, dozens of crew members dead, and every remaining vessel damaged in ways that would take weeks to repair fully. Elena Voss knew, better than anyone, that the battle had been won through surprise and clever engineering, rather than any real advantage in raw strength. The Concorde would not be caught the same way twice. "They're rebuilding their shield calibration protocols across the entire fleet," Marcus Chen reported during an emergency briefing. "Every ship in the new formation will be resistant to the kinetic and electromagnetic combination that worked at the Moon. We need something new, and we need it fast." "How fast is fast?" Voss asked. "Their new fleet is already 3 weeks out," Marcus said grimly. "And this time, intelligence suggests it isn't 40 ships, it's closer to 200. The number settled over the room like a physical weight. 200 Concorde vessels, compared to the 10 damaged ships humanity had left, was not a battle that could be won through clever tricks alone. It would require something more, something the coalition had not yet fully developed. Sarah Klein received grim news of her own, during her next contact with Kalen Dross. The Concord scientist looked different this time, more tired, more strained, as if the weeks since the moon battle had worn on her as heavily as they had on every human involved in the war. The council vote after the battle was close, Kalen admitted, closer than I expected. Enough delegates were shaken by your resistance that a full reclassification vote may become possible, but only if you survive what comes next. Threll has been given full authority over the next engagement. He intends to end this decisively. Full planetary bombardment is authorized if ground resistance proves too costly to overcome directly. They're going to bomb the planet, Sarah said, her voice flat with disbelief, even after everything that had already happened. Only as a last measure, Kalen said. Threll still believes, genuinely believes, that mercy matters. He would prefer surrender and orderly closure over destruction. But he will not hesitate if he believes destruction is the only remaining option. You must understand something about him. He does not hate you. He pities you. And in his mind, ending your suffering, by any means necessary, is an act of compassion. That's not compassion, Sarah snapped. That's just cruelty, wearing a kinder mask. I know, Kalen said quietly. I have spent 40 years of my life studying your species, and I no longer believe what the Council has believed for so long. But belief alone will not stop 200 ships. Only survival will do that. Elena Voss took the intelligence and immediately reorganized every remaining resource the Coalition possessed. There was no time to build an entirely new fleet capable of matching 200 Concorde vessels directly. Instead, humanity would need to rely on something the Concorde, in 11,000 years of warfare against similarly advanced civilizations, had almost certainly never encountered before. A defense built not around a single decisive fleet battle, but around the entire planet itself. We fight this everywhere, Voss told the assembled coalition leadership. Not just in orbit. Every continent, every ocean, every city, if it comes to that. They expect a single battle to decide everything, the way it always has for them. We give them a war, with no single battle to win. We give them a war that never truly ends, until we decide it does. It was a strategy built on desperation, as much as ingenuity. But across the following 3 weeks, humanity built exactly that. Underground bunkers, hidden weapon caches, mobile defense platforms scattered across every landmass on the planet, coordinated through a communication network so distributed that no single strike, however powerful, could disable it entirely. Civilian populations were moved wherever possible into deep shelters, constructed with a speed that would have seemed impossible only months earlier, back when nations still fought each other over borders and resources, instead of standing together against a shared threat. Marcus Chen's team, meanwhile, worked around the clock developing new weapon systems, no longer relying solely on the kinetic and electromagnetic combination that Concorde ships had already adapted against. Drawing on data gathered during the moon battle itself, his team identified a new vulnerability. This one in how Concorde ships handled sustained, layered attacks, combining multiple weapon types simultaneously, rather than a single overwhelming strike. Their shields are built to handle one type of threat at a time, even multiple threats of the same type, Marcus explained. What they're not built for is facing 3 or 4 completely different attack types simultaneously, each one forcing a different part of the shield system to respond at once. It's not about hitting harder. It's about making them defend against everything at once until something gives. It was a fragile theory, untested against a real Concorde fleet, but it was the best option available, and across every remaining shipyard and weapons facility on the planet, engineers began adapting their designs accordingly. The Concorde fleet arrived on the 22nd day, and it was every bit as overwhelming as intelligence had suggested. 200 ships spread across near-Earth space, forming a perimeter that seemed to blot out sections of the sky itself when viewed from the ground. At its center, Overseer Threll's flagship, repaired now from the damage sustained at the moon, broadcast a final message to the planet below. You have proven capable of resistance, Threll's voice said, calm once more, though something in its tone carried an edge that had not been there during the very first broadcast months earlier. This does not change the fundamental truth of your classification. It only means closure will require greater force than initially anticipated. I offer one final opportunity for surrender. Submit now, and the process can still be conducted with dignity. Resist, and I will be forced to conclude this in whatever manner proves necessary. Elena Voss did not hesitate before responding. Her message broadcast not just to the Concorde fleet, but to every person on the planet at the same time. "We already gave you our answer at the moon," she said. "You want to know what a dead species looks like? We're about to show you exactly what a living one looks like instead." The battle that followed became known, in the years afterward, simply as the Siege of Earth, and it would be studied for generations as one of the most desperate and inventive defensive campaigns in human history. The Concorde fleet did not attempt a single decisive strike, as it had at the moon. Instead, Threll ordered a methodical, overwhelming advance, ships moving in coordinated waves designed to overwhelm any single point of resistance through sheer numbers. The Continuance fleet, badly outnumbered, could not meet this advance directly. Instead, following the strategy Voss had spent weeks preparing, humanity's defense became something scattered and relentless, striking from 100 different directions at once. Mobile railgun platforms hidden in mountain ranges across 6 continents opened fire the moment Concorde ships came within range, their positions constantly shifting to avoid retaliation. Orbital mines, seeded across countless possible approach vectors during the preceding weeks, detonated unpredictably as Concorde vessels advanced. Small, fast attack craft, built cheaply and in massive numbers, using designs finalized only days earlier, swarmed larger Concorde ships in overwhelming numbers, each one carrying the new combined weapon systems Marcus Chen's team had developed. It was chaotic, costly, and unlike anything Concorde military doctrine had prepared its commanders to face. 11,000 years of warfare had taught the Concorde to fight wars of scale and precision against enemies who fought the same way. Humanity offered instead a war of numbers and desperation and constant, grinding attrition, refusing every attempt to force a single decisive engagement. 3 days into the siege, Concorde losses had climbed higher than any single engagement in recorded Concorde military history. 18 ships destroyed outright, dozens more damaged badly enough to require withdrawal, and still, humanity's defense held, battered and bleeding but unbroken, drawing on reserves that seemed to appear from every corner of the planet at once. Aboard his flagship, Overseer Threll watched the mounting losses with an expression his crew had come to recognize over the preceding weeks, a mixture of disbelief and something that might, in another being, have been called doubt. "Overseer," said his senior tactical officer, "the Council is requesting an immediate status report. Losses of this magnitude have not been recorded in any previous closure procedure." "I am aware," Threll said quietly. "Some among the Council are questioning whether the classification itself requires reconsideration." Threll turned to look at the tactical display, watching as another wave of small human attack craft tore through a formation of Concorde escorts, sacrificing themselves in numbers that should have been unsustainable, but somehow kept coming regardless. "A dying species does not fight like this," he said, almost to himself. "It cannot fight like this, and yet, here it is, fighting exactly like this." Kaelin Dross, watching the same battle from a support vessel positioned safely behind the main fleet, felt something shift inside her as she monitored the unfolding chaos below. She had spent 40 years believing in the possibility of humanity's redemption, arguing for it against overwhelming skepticism, and now she watched that belief prove itself true in the most brutal way imaginable. She opened a channel directly to Threll's flagship, bypassing normal protocol entirely. "Overseer," she said, "I request permission to present evidence to the Council immediately, not after this engagement concludes. Now, while it is still happening." Threll was silent for a long moment. "Granted," he said finally, and something in his voice suggested even he was no longer entirely certain of the outcome he had once considered inevitable. On the ground, in a command bunker deep beneath what remained of the original Colorado facility, now reinforced against the possibility of direct orbital strikes, Elena Voss coordinated a defense that stretched across the entire planet, her voice hoarse from 3 days of continuous command, her eyes red from lack of sleep. Marcus Chen worked beside her, adjusting weapon calibrations in real time as Concorde ships adapted their shields yet again, forcing constant innovation on a battlefield that never stopped shifting. "We're losing ground in the Pacific sector," an officer reported. 3 railgun platforms destroyed. Concorde forces pushing toward a ground assault. "Reroute reserves from the European sector," Voss ordered without hesitation. "We hold everywhere, or we hold nowhere." There's no in-between. It was a battle unlike anything the planet had ever seen, fought not for territory or resources, but for the simple right to continue existing. And as the third day stretched into a fourth, both sides began to understand, in their own ways, that this was no longer simply a closure procedure or a desperate defense. It had become something else entirely, a test that would decide not just the fate of one species, but the very rules by which the Concorde itself operated. Somewhere far above the battered but unbroken planet, Kalen Dross prepared to make an argument that would either save humanity or condemn it entirely, depending on whether the council above still believed, after everything they had witnessed, that Earth's story had already been written. By the fifth day of the siege, both sides had been pushed to the edge of what they could sustain. The continuance fleet, what remained of it, had been reduced to scattered fragments, no longer capable of coordinated large-scale engagement, relying instead on ground-based defenses and small, desperate strikes wherever an opening appeared. Casualties had climbed into numbers that no one in the coalition command wanted to say aloud. Cities near major defense installations had been evacuated entirely, their populations sheltering in bunkers built in a frantic rush over the preceding weeks. Humanity was bleeding, badly, and everyone from General Elena Voss down to the youngest volunteer manning a railgun platform in the mountains understood that the defense could not hold much longer through sheer attrition alone. But the Concorde fleet was bleeding too, in ways it had never experienced in 11,000 years of recorded warfare. Losses had climbed past 60 ships, nearly a third of the entire invasion force, destroyed not through a single decisive weapon, but through the relentless, grinding accumulation of 100 smaller wounds, each one delivered by a species that refused to stop fighting, no matter how impossible the odds became. Aboard his flagship, Overseer Threll convened an emergency meeting with his senior command staff, the weight of the unprecedented losses evident in every word exchanged. Full planetary bombardment remains authorized, his tactical officer reminded him. A single coordinated strike from the remaining fleet could end ground resistance within hours. Threll said nothing for a long moment, staring at the tactical display showing the chaotic, sprawling battle still raging across the planet below. Humanity's forces scattered and desperate, but somehow, impossibly, still fighting after 5 days of continuous engagement. "Bring me casualty projections," he said finally. "For both sides. Complete projections, not summaries." The numbers, when they arrived, told a story that even Threll, certain as he had been from the very beginning, found difficult to reconcile with everything he believed about dying species. Humanity's losses were catastrophic by any measure, yet the resistance showed no sign of the collapse that should have accompanied losses of that magnitude. If anything, coordination across the planet's scattered defense network had actually improved over the course of the battle, as if the species learned and adapted faster under pressure than the Concorde's own extensive historical models predicted possible. It was at this moment that Kalen Dross's emergency request reached the full council, still watching the engagement unfold from their distant chamber, 20 light-years away. She stood before delegates from dozens of species, beings who had collectively witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations across 11,000 years, and made her case with everything she had. "You have watched 300 species classified as dead across the history of this Concorde," she said. In every single case, that classification proved accurate. Every species faced with certain destruction eventually collapsed, fractured, turned against itself, or simply gave up entirely, exactly as our models predicted. I ask you now to look at what is happening on the world below us. 5 days of continuous engagement against overwhelming force, catastrophic losses on every front, and still they coordinate. Still they adapt. Still they fight. Not with the desperate chaos of a dying species, but with the growing sophistication of one learning, in real time, how to survive against odds it was never meant to overcome. One of the council delegates, an ancient being from a species that had joined the Concorde over 6,000 years earlier, spoke with evident skepticism. Desperation can mimic sophistication for a time. This proves nothing beyond the fact that they fight hard before the end. Then consider this, Kalen said. In 11,000 years of Concorde history, has any other dead species classification ever destroyed 60 vessels of an invading fleet? Has any other species facing certain destruction ever caused a council vote on reclassification to even be considered mid-conflict, as is happening now? I am not asking you to believe humanity is perfect, or even that they are certain to survive. I am asking you to recognize that everything happening below us contradicts the fundamental assumption this entire classification system was built upon. They are not simply resisting the way a cornered animal resists. They are growing, adapting, and improving faster under existential pressure than any species this Concord has ever measured. The debate that followed stretched across hours, even as the battle below continued, delegates arguing bitterly over data and precedent, and the very foundations of a classification system that had guided Concord policy for millennia. Kalen fought for every point, drawing on decades of research, presenting evidence gathered not just from the current battle, but from the entire span of human history, a species that had clawed its way back from the edge of extinction, more times than any other civilization the Concord had ever catalogued. On the sixth day, as the council debate finally reached its conclusion, the battle below reached its own breaking point. Elena Voss, exhausted beyond anything she had known was possible, received reports of a final massed Concord assault forming above the Pacific. A coordinated strike from over 40 remaining ships, aimed directly at the largest concentration of surviving human defense infrastructure. It was, by every calculation her exhausted staff could produce, an attack the remaining coalition forces could not survive. All remaining reserves, she ordered, her voice hoarse but steady. Everything we have left. Every railgun platform, every attack craft, every soldier who can still stand. This is it. Marcus Chen, running on stimulants and desperation after days without real sleep, made one final adjustment to the weapon systems his team had spent the entire siege refining. A combination targeting protocol drawing on every piece of data gathered from 6 days of continuous combat against an adapting enemy. It's ready, he said. It's everything we've learned, all of it, combined into one final protocol. If this doesn't work, I don't think we have anything left to try. The final battle above the Pacific became, in the years that followed, the single most studied military engagement in human history. 40 Concord ships descended in a coordinated strike against the last significant concentration of human defense, and humanity met them with everything that remained, every weapon, every tactic, every lesson learned across 6 brutal days of war, thrown into a single, desperate, coordinated response. It should not have worked. By every reasonable measure, the exhausted, battered remnants of humanity's defense should have been overwhelmed within minutes. Instead, drawing on 6 days of accumulated data about exactly how Concord shields adapted and responded, Marcus Chen's final combined weapon protocol tore through the attacking formation, with a precision that even the Concord's own tactical analysts, watching in growing disbelief, struggled to explain. 11 Concord ships were destroyed in the opening minutes alone. The remaining vessels, their shield calibrations rendered obsolete by a targeting system built specifically to counter exactly the adaptations they had made over the preceding days, found themselves suddenly vulnerable in ways their 11,000 years of military doctrine had never prepared them to handle. Aboard his flagship, Overseer Threll watched the final assault collapse in real time, the last of his fleet's momentum broken against a defense that, by every model his species had built over millennia, should have shattered long before now. It was at this exact moment that the Council's decision reached him. The message was brief, transmitted directly and without ceremony, the culmination of hours of desperate argument 20 light-years away. Humanity's classification as a dead species was suspended, pending further review. All closure procedures were to cease immediately. The Council had recognized, at last, what Kalen Dross had spent months trying to prove, that whatever humanity was, it was not what the Concord's ancient models had predicted, and no further action could be taken against a species whose classification was now formally in question. Threll received the order and sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the tactical display showing his broken, retreating fleet and the battered, victorious planet below. "Overseer," his tactical officer said carefully. "Your orders?" Threll was quiet for a moment longer. "Full withdrawal," he said finally. "All remaining forces. Immediately." The Concord fleet, what remained of it, less than half its original strength, began its retreat from Earth's orbit within the hour, leaving behind a planet scarred and exhausted but unbroken, its people emerging slowly from bunkers and shelters across every continent, to look up at a sky finally empty of enemy ships for the first time in months. Elena Voss stood in the command center beneath Colorado, watching the retreat unfold on the tactical display, and allowed herself, for the first time in 6 days, to simply breathe. "Is it over?" someone asked quietly. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But we're still here. That's more than they expected." That's more than anyone expected. In the months that followed, the full weight of what had happened began to settle across the planet. Humanity had survived, not through avoiding the fight the Concord brought, but by proving, in the most costly way imaginable, that the story written for their species was wrong. The Council's decision to suspend the classification did not mean immediate acceptance into the Concord, nor did it erase the losses suffered during 6 days of brutal war. Millions had died. Cities lay in ruins. The scars of the conflict would remain visible for generations. But something else had changed too, something that went beyond the immediate relief of survival. For the first time in recorded history, every nation on Earth had stood together, had built together, had fought together, against a threat that made every old rivalry seem small by comparison. Nations that had spent decades unable to agree on climate policy or trade disputes now found themselves bound by something deeper, a shared memory of standing at the edge of extinction and refusing, together, to fall. Sarah Klein continued her negotiations with the Concord in the months that followed, working alongside Kaylin Dross, who remained humanity's strongest advocate, as the slow process of full reclassification review began. It would take years, they both knew, for the Concord to fully reconsider a judgment, 11,000 years in the making. But the door, once closed, now stood open. Marcus Chen returned to civilian life eventually, though the work he had done during those desperate months would shape human technology and defense policy for generations to come. He often thought about something Kaylin had said, relayed to him through Sarah, during the darkest days of the siege, that no dying species had ever learned this fast, adapted this well, or refused this completely to accept the ending written for it. Elena Voss, addressing the newly formed Global Defense Council months after the Concord's withdrawal, offered words that would be remembered long after the details of the war itself faded into history and legend. They looked at our history and saw only the wars, the mistakes, the damage we'd done to ourselves and our world, she said. They weren't entirely wrong to see those things. We've made terrible mistakes, and will likely make more, but they missed something important. Something they'd never seen in 300 other species they'd judged the same way. They missed the part of us that refuses to quit, even when quitting would be so much easier. The part of us that finds a way to stand together, exactly when standing together matters most. She paused, looking out at the assembled representatives from every nation on Earth, a gathering that would have been unthinkable just a year earlier. They came here to write the final chapter of our story, she said. They found out, the hard way, that we're not finished yet, we're just getting started. Far above the planet, the last Concord ships faded from sensor range, carrying news of an impossible war, back to a council that would spend years debating exactly what humanity truly was. Below them, a wounded but unbroken world began, slowly and carefully, the long work of rebuilding, carrying forward the fragile, hard-won unity that had been forged in the fire of a war nobody had believed humanity could survive. The dead species had refused to die, and the galaxy, whether it was ready or not, would have to reckon with what came next.